And last week, the Senate received President Muhammadu Buhari's request for approval of the 2021 Supplementary Appropriation Bill of 895.8 billion naira. The FG is proposing to fund 45.63 billion of the 83.56 billion required for the COVID-19 vaccine program by drawing on existing World Bank loans, which will be structured as well as other grants totaling 113.2 million US dollars. While the balance of 37.93 billion required for COVID-19 vaccines, salaries and other health-related expenditures totaling 41.6 billion naira and 48.2 billion recurrent component of defense and security will be funded by borrowing 135 billion naira from some special reserve levy account. According to the federal government, the availability of COVID-19 vaccines and the procurement terms was still uncertain as at the time of finalizing the 2021 budget. Hence, there was no provision in the 2021 Appropriation Act for the procurement and administration of COVID-19 vaccines. Well, to have this conversation, Oladipo Ajayi, the head of fixed income at Chapel Hill Denham, joins us to tell us how this will affect the markets and other related issues. Thank you for joining us, Oladipo.
Great to have you. Thank you very much for having me around.
Yeah, so the funding of the supplementary budget is proposed to be a mix of local funding and grants as well as existing World Bank loans. Considering this recurrent expenditure, what are you comfortable with this?
Yeah, normally, if you look at the borrowing mix that actually for the proposed budget, it looks good because as we speak, currently what they are trying to do is they're trying to raise about 722 billion locally in the local market. And at the same time, they are also trying to actually draw down on loan with international financial organization and also from the special drawing account. So if you look at the mix, it's still very much okay because it's not more of foreign borrowing compared to local borrowing, but just that it has its own adverse effect as well. But when you borrow heavily locally, what that would mean is that you are crowding up the local market. And it might actually be very difficult for local corporate institutions to actually access the domestic market to actually raise that capital.
Okay, but analysts do say it's not a wrong thing to borrow, but when you're borrowing for recurrent purposes, then, there might be a source of worry, even though now it's essential because we're talking of COVID-19, which was, something that just came upon the world. But when we are borrowing for salaries, for these recurrent expenses, should we be worried about that?
Yeah, I think we should really be worried when we're actually borrowing to actually pay salaries. Because, sincerely speaking, there's nothing wrong with borrowing, but you must borrow to actually develop your economy. And when you borrow to consume, it's worrying and it's call for concern. And that's why one of the reasons when you see the government borrowing to actually pay salary, you feel we are just spending or we are just wasting off the future. But what we need to borrow to do is to borrow to develop and create jobs, so that we'll be able to actually expand the country and expand the economy. So borrowing to consume is not a reasonable.
Would you say there's an alternative way of borrowing for this purpose or raising funds, more like it, for the purpose of salaries when it comes to COVID and those unplanned situation?
Yeah, I think as we speak, we all know that the capacity to generate revenue is still very much low. Currently in the country, so we don't have what it takes to actually form most of these obligations. But when we look at the COVID vaccine, that still makes a lot of sense because we know what the impact will be. So what that will mean that it will help the economy to open up and people will be able to do business without any fear to actually go out there and do their businesses. And on the other hand, if you look at way to raise funds to actually fund most of these things, the only way you have to do is to actually borrow. And borrowing is the best way to borrow for us as we speak. Because of the FX crisis, is for us to actually borrow locally.
Yeah, so you talk about raising funds. I mean, one of the stories we read before you came on was that the federal government has decided to tax foreign tech companies as a way of raising funds, even though this will come as a surprise because we would think that companies are already paying tax and all that. So do you see this as one of those ways you were referring to as raising funds instead of borrowing to pay salaries?
Yeah, that is also another way for us to actually adopt or actually explore to actually raise funds for us to actually, because as we speak now, we know we need to expand our revenue generating capacity. And if we don't do that, that means that the country will continue to actually struggle. Because if you look at last year, Q1 last year, our debt, our cost of servicing debt to revenue was about 99.1%. That does not make any sense to anyone because it means that as much as what you generated is what you use to actually service your obligations. So it doesn't make any good sense for us to continue in that way. We need to expand our revenue generating capacity, and one of the ways to do that is to develop the economy, create infrastructure. Even there was a report released by World Bank yesterday that was talking about us wasting close to about 10 trillion annually, so because of epileptic power supply. So we need to actually raise funds to actually develop that sector. By doing that, you are expanding the economy. By expanding the economy, the end result will be revenue generation on the part of the government.
All right, let's look at the markets now. How do you think the funding of the supplementary budget will affect the debt market locally?
Will put further pressure on the local market. Like I mentioned earlier on, that's another 722 billion coming to be raised in the local market. And what that means is that it will put a lot of pressure on the domestic market and corporates. A lot of corporates might not be able to actually access funds locally because of the new supplementary budget that is being proposed by the government. And on the other hand, what that will mean to the market is that we'll actually see yield actually climbing up as a result of further borrowing from the government.
Well, the national has confirmed that Nigeria's debt profile stood at 33.11 trillion naira as of March 2021. Now, yesterday in the papers, I don't know if you saw that, some eminent Nigerians are clamoring to international financial institutions to stop lending to Nigeria. First, what's your thoughts about this group of Nigerians who have come up with this, and how do you think this will affect the country's funding plans?
Yeah, for people that are actually clamoring that international financial institutions should stop lending money to Nigeria, they are right to some extent. And one of their reasons is just what we highlighted earlier, is the fact that if we continue to borrow for consumption, I think there's no reason why we need to borrow. In times like that, what you need to do is that you need to cut costs. When you cut costs, you'll be able to align your costs with your revenue generating capacity. So why, about the other hand, is that we need to borrow to actually develop the economy. And another way to do that is that we also need to actually go into a lot of partnership with some of these corporates. If you look at that Bagada Expressway, look at the PPP agreement with between the Dangote federal government and the likes, those are laudable way to actually develop the economy. So when you develop the economy, it will help you to actually grow your economy. So for on the part of people clamoring that international financial institutions should stop lending money to us, I think they are right to some extent, but just that they forgot to look at the angle of also borrowing for development and not for consumption.
So how do you think their clamor will affect the country's funding plans?
Yeah, now that they are clamoring, I think a lot of the lenders will now begin to take a second look at the reasons why you're borrowing. And I think it's a wake-up call to the government as well, because they now find, with what's on the table now, it's crystal clear that a lot of people are monitoring the implementation of their borrowing. So as a result of that, people can now track what you actually expend the money you actually borrowed on, and that will also help for accountability. I think this is a very good one on their part, and also on the part of lenders too. Most of the lenders will now begin to put those clauses in their agreements, so as to ensure that the money borrowed is actually deployed for the purpose at which it was actually borrowed.
Okay, but could the lenders be, held liable? For instance, the country cannot repay, but they still keep lending.
I don't think we are at that point where we will not be able to actually pay them. So we are not at that point. If you look at it critically, our debt to GDP ratio is still sub 40. And sincerely speaking, although that's not also a good metrics for us to measure our performance, because we also need to look at it in the light of our revenue to cost of service index. Also, we have to look at that. But I don't think there's any cause for alarm as to us repaying our debt.
But Fitch Ratings has projected that Nigeria's debt to revenue ratio will rise up to 395% by 2022. This is 2021. That's just next year, indicating that growth rates in public debt would far outstrip its revenue. So don't you think we should start working on this now?
Yeah. Like, I highlighted something earlier on, and what I highlighted was the fact that we need to actually cut costs. Because before coming on this show, I saw the headlines from Kaduna State government that is talking about downsizing the government workers to actually fit the need for the government. I think in some instances we need to actually work around that, so cutting costs to actually align our costs with our revenue generating capacity. Because if you look at it's alarming when you see news like that coming on board that our cost of servicing debt will rise almost like 395% by next year when you compare to our capacity revenue. But I think it's also a wake-up call for the government to start looking at one thing. One of the things they need to start looking at ways to actually increase our revenue generating capacity, how to increase the tax debt, and how to actually work on reducing costs so that we can fall within our target. And I think as we speak now, the governments will have a target at which they are actually working around for. You need to have a metrics to actually measure yourself. You need to start looking at what metrics do you want your revenue, cost of service debt to revenue to be, so as to actually be able to actually work around your cost to actually fall within that borderline. So I think that news is actually worrying, but it's also a wake-up call for the government to start doing something around it before it actually crystallizes.
Okay, so the PW says there are just about 10 million taxpayers in Nigeria. Do you think an increase in this number would reduce the need for debt?
Yeah, I think there's still a lot of people that are outside the tax net that the government needs to find a way to actually bring into the net. And I've said something earlier on that one of the ways to actually bring people to the net is that you must be able, for you to ask for a hand, you must be able to touch the heart. You have to create infrastructure for business, for SMEs, for MSMEs, that will actually help their business. It's on that front that you can lure them into that tax bracket or tax net. When businesses actually run their whole business structure by themselves, they create security, they create power, they do all those their leakages on the part of governments. And I think that's one of the reasons why World Bank mentioned that because of power epilepsy, we're actually losing close to 10 trillion naira annually. So it tells us that there are wastage, that if we can work around for us to develop our economy around that, we'll be able to actually bring such revenue into the buckets. And that will help us to actually foot some of the obligations that we have on the table.
All right, thank you so much. We'll have to leave it there now. Oladipo Ajayi is head fixed income at Chapel Hill Denham. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're most welcome.
All right, we'll take a moment now. Business Morning returns. Do stay with us.